As we enter 2026, this will mark yet another year of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Another year of Zelensky shuttling back between the EU, kind of top brass, Donald Trump, and now has a purported 20-point peace plan, just like the one that the Trump administration pushed with Gaza and Israel. It's another 20 points. It will be divisive, but a lot of the analysts I follow say that it is the closest we've ever been to a ceasefire. And there are a lot of levers or like variables in that negotiation that I find super interesting. But kind of in a contrarian way. The angle that I want to take is not around whether the ceasefire will pass or whether it will hold, but instead do a retrospective on how this unexpected European conflict will go down in the history books as another step change in the definition of how war is prosecuted. Meaning, there's only 5 or 6 wars in world history that are lauded by all historians as changing the game for how battles are conducted. If you listen, I geek out on history, so I could tell you a little bit about the Peloponnesian Wars in the 4th century BC and how some of like the key strategy that they unveiled forever changed the game. You could do the same thing with the American Civil War and how the railroad and telegraphs and the rifling in guns changed the game. Honestly, I'm skipping around, but the 100 Years' War in the 1400s, it changed the game from knights on their horseback to gunpowder and like the early trenches. And the really obvious one, World War I and II, absolutely changed the game because of what is often the step function of technology and innovation. In World War I, it was the mass scale mechanization of tanks, of submarines, of automatic weapons. World War II, you see all of a sudden the actual struggle for the skies being like one of the defining variables and who ended up winning. The advent of the nuclear bomb, all of that is innovation disseminating into the ranks, and oftentimes the victor being the one that can adopt the technology the fastest and the most strategically. And here's where I'm just going to drill right in and make the case that what I've witnessed following the conflict in Ukraine and Russia has all of the fingerprints of that rapid rate of change. And it's all around technology. And increasingly, it's all around AI. And the kind of military that the U.S. built throughout the Cold War that we then tried to leverage in the kind of wars of terror in the early 2000s, it is completely antiquated in this new domain, the AI era, defined by drones, cyber warfare, and for a host of reasons, the U.S. needs to get its act together quick. So I'm going to explain how I've experienced the rapid rate of technological innovation, stage by stage, in the 3+ years in Ukraine. And then I'm going to jump right to what are my 10 contrarian predictions of where warfare will be in this next generation and how the U.S. needs to stay on the cutting edge. And then I'll end with like a definition of what I think the American military will look like in a simple sentence that I'll have a thesis statement at the end. So here's my telling of, once again, the 3+ years of the conflict in Ukraine. And it starts with, and I'm just going to chart the advent of commercial drones, the drones that you and I could buy at Costco from DJI for less than $1,000, and all the really creative and nefarious use cases for dropping explosives, for reconnaissance, for even supply chains. Once Ukraine discovered that, it almost opened Pandora's box where both sides played a similar game to what my job as a startup entrepreneur looks like when I'm competing with my competitors. Ukraine introducing the commercial drone, the one that can be mass produced cheaply. And what are then the iterations? Yes, they secured like early surprising dominance, and then it became a game of, well, what is the next vector to improve? And Ukraine and Russia started quickly introducing drones that were used for recreational racing in the US. So once again, this is all stuff that you and I could buy at Costco down the street. But now it's, oh, my drone's faster than yours. I'm just going to keep going. You're going to see how these dominoes play really quickly. From the racing drone, within like at the start of year 2, you then see quite literally what Ukraine called the bullet and string, a sting drone, which literally is a Ukrainian soldier miles back from the front, donning a VR headset. If you know my career as a founder, spent a lot of time in VR. Sometimes it's the same VR headsets that our learners use. VR headset, joystick, and then uses a drone that is so optimized for speed, it can get up to 125 miles an hour simply to collide into the oncoming drone and stop it from releasing its explosives over Ukrainian territory. So you see this tick for tack, commercial to racing, to then defensive racing, to then all of a sudden, the next quick iteration in year 2 is the concept of radio jamming a Russian or Ukrainian drone so that as it approaches the high value target, typically within that last 500 to 1,000 meters, Russians in particular quickly perfected the idea of how do we now jam the radio signal and have that drone disconnect from its pilot and crash in the field instead of crashing over an arms like manufacturing plant. And now just keep following the tit for tat. Once the radio jamming was introduced, we're still barely in year 2. Ukraine innovated. This is where it starts to get so crazy in sci-fi. Fiber optic drones that quite literally have a spool of fiber optic wiring that could carry up to 20 kilometers so that they wouldn't get stopped by the radio jamming frequencies. So all of a sudden, in year 2, I start seeing these crazy images of fields and kind of the no man's land, the hotly contested front, fields completely covered with fiber optic line because of the thousands of drones that are getting flown back and forth, evading the radio jamming technology because they're still connected to the pilot's actual joystick. It's crazy. So you have these, once again, like huge swaths of land that are now just covered with fiber optic cabling. In response to that, once that started working, the Russians intentionally sought cover in just a heavily wooded territory that was impossible for the drones to make out with their kind of like computer vision cameras. What's the next innovation? It almost feels medieval. The Ukrainians introduce the Dragon drone, a 4-wing drone with molten thermite that will burn up to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to the point that it will melt through metal. And the Dragon drones would intentionally almost like carpet bomb the wooded areas that the Russians they knew were hiding in. And the 4,000 degree molten would instantly singe the forest kind of like tree cover, singe all the weapons, and singe the Russians using them. the accounts that I've read over that time period were Russians describing like a medieval being at the gate and someone pouring a vat of like hot oil on you. Just insane. I'm like, how is this not showing up in everyone's news feeds? This is unthinkable. Is this what warfare is now? It's just your drone against mine and who can be more creative? Yes. Then the Russians, kind of their next innovation. They quite literally call it like the super camera drone. They had automatic computer vision technology on the front and back, just like your car has a rear view mirror looking behind you. And the moment any of those kind of defensive drones were spotted, instead of the pilot actually trying to control an evasive maneuver, it started to use AI to automate instantaneous barrel rolls and defensive maneuvers to evade the defensive drones. Then the next one, and once this is in a matter of 3 years. Hopefully, I'm saying this in a way that you're like, Quinn, wait, what? I've known about the war in Ukraine, and I haven't heard any of this. The one that really got interesting is a term called terminal automation, where once the fiber optic drones started to get consistently stopped, they were moving slower, they were clunkier. Quite literally, the Russians were putting up like netting to protect against them. The Ukrainians innovated yet again with drones that would be manually powered until the target was within sight, typically 500 meters, which is right where the radio jamming would click in. And as long as the pilot could pinpoint the target destination and lock on, he would actually intentionally turn off his control and allow AI to navigate the drone once the radio jamming disconnected him that last 500 meters, and it all of a sudden ensured the efficacy of the attack from like 30 to 80% because AI took care of the last mile, or in this case, the last 500 meters. So whatever that is, 20% of a mile. The iteration that we're now in is one where both sides are spending inordinate resources continuing to innovate on the drone technology and the best way to mass produce while being really thoughtful of their advantages and disadvantages. For Ukraine, it's funding. Without the last $80 billion grant from the EU, they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. So the kinds of drones that they're continuing to innovate on are like drones that some of the majority is like really built by lightweight wood. On the Russian side, they've figured out how to kind of do an end run around all of the tariffs by using the chips in washing machines to mass produce drones. Once again, it's the game of the innovator. And both how to innovate on offense and how to innovate on defense. Where for the first 2 years, it were those Sting drones with the VR headset going 125 miles an hour trying to ram into the oncoming attacker. Now all the tech that's seeing a ton of innovation in places like the US, Israel, Ukraine, and China, it quite literally is now heavily focused on, it's going to sound so crazy in Star Wars, lasers. I kid you not. Lasers that can pinpoint to the size of a nickel such extreme heat that if it can stay focused on the correct point of the oncoming drone or cruise missile, that if it can stay focused for up to 2, maybe 3 seconds on that fixed point, it will barrel through kind of the outer shell of the bomb and detonate it. Like, that exists? That's possible? That's so crazy. And the other one being high-powered microwave defensive systems. I'm like, microwave? Like the one in my kitchen? Yes. Literally, when I tried to read up on it, it's like, it is, in effect, the same core technology, but times 10,000 of a microwave pointed into not the size of a nickel, but a much wider terrain that any oncoming drone or missile, the internal computing gets fried when it passes through that barrier, and it either doesn't explode or it loses its target and hopefully explodes in a field. Sci-fi. So totally sci-fi. My point in illustrating all of that is in 3 years, I could count more than like the 8 examples I just gave, but close to 30 examples of rapid innovation trying to get an edge on kind of your antagonist, to the point that the first cycle lasted a year. And right now, the cycles of innovation between Ukraine and Russia are lasting 4 to 6 weeks. Quite literally what the average software team spends on a engineering sprint, 4 to 6 weeks. And then you got to push your product update. Same thing in Ukraine and Russia. How is that then? What are the downstream effects? Maybe just the real human impact. Because when I tried to speculate before I like dove in, it's like, oh man, does this mean that all of the casualties will just be how many drones get destroyed? And then like a question of supply chain and resources and funding? Right now, no. The net effect, especially on Russia, who obviously has close to 4 or 5x the manpower, is in year 1 of the conflict, Russians average 200 casualties per day. It's 5x'd in the last 12 months. Russia has now amassed 1 million casualties. A quarter of those are quite literally deaths. 80% of those casualties in the last year were all caused by drones. 80%. And all of a sudden, and this just paints a picture for the kind of leadership Russia has. What are the tactics and the value of human life in this new era of warfare? There are all these accounts and videos online of Russia knowing full well they have their highly trained senior kind of infantry. And the main way they've been able to kind of fuel the war machine has been leveraging convicts, like soldiers that have tried to escape the front line, kind of that lower class. And the term that they literally use now is drone bait. Because that front line, what is now called the transparency zone, it's all this new vocab that I've never heard about in warfare. The front line, we now can assume is so heavily monitored by drone technology that the moment something moves, it's dead on arrival. Russia will send out one at a time that lower tier soldier to intentionally draw in a host of drones. It's a death sentence to either try to expend the drone technology or to create some opening elsewhere on the military front to take advantage of. There are videos of these Russian convicts that quite literally are tied to trees as drone bait, like confirmed by top tier news sites, not just some like Twitter thread. This is, once again, it paints a picture for the scruples that the Russian leadership has, but it also shows what kind of tactics can emerge in this new era of warfare. In the same way, the confirmed accounts of Russia using this really high definition technology with top tier cameras and intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure, buses in Ukraine, hospitals, with no alibi. There's no way you can say, I have a 4K camera and a drone pilot tucked back from the front line who's operating it, who didn't know that he drove his drone directly into a school bus. Like, sorry, there's no way you get around that. But those are the kinds of accounts that we're reading from the front line. So all of a sudden, this isn't some glass half full that because we're relying so much more on technology, it actually preserves human life. The stats don't point that direction. In fact, it's only accelerating Russia's. It's only showing their true colors more. What I hope you see from what I've shared so far is that the rate of innovation just in the drone technology category is moving at such an unprecedented pace that it needs to be a wake-up call for the US and our allies. And all of a sudden, and I have them prepped here, written up, I've got a handful of predictions from me doing a deep dive over the last month or two around where our military needs to go. Some of them are going to make a lot of sense, and some of them are going to be a little surprising. The first one that is thankfully becoming like the common parlance of military procurement in the US. And it's all these fancy words. I'm going to tell them to you, but I don't expect you to remember them. A shift from exquisite systems, that's the exact word they use, meaning the $10 to $50 million weapon system, exquisite, super, super high end, cooked up by Raytheon over a generation, and highly, highly sophisticated, but therefore a really small supply. To the opposite, it's this funny word that I don't know if they made it up, but it's coming from the word attrition, like a war of attrition, attritable, meaning we need to rethink our weaponization around mass and speed. How do we build massive quantity very quickly? That is thankfully starting to take root. And it's not coming from the defense primes that the last two generations knew about. The Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing players. It's from the new defense contractors, this next generation of tech first, the Andurils, the Shield AIs, that don't even wait anymore for an RFP to come out through the DoD, but instead they just use their venture capital dollars to innovate what they think are the most creative solutions to what they're seeing on the battlefield today without any commitment of purchase. But thankfully, they're so quick and so capable that the military ends up backing in and purchasing nonetheless, even though the military didn't technically ask for it. But it's accelerating this cycle of innovation in the US in a really invaluable way. The next one, I'm going to start rattling through these quicker, is the idea of automated decision making programmed through AI. That's another game changer that will ultimately need to get legislated around. What's the US's stance? Do we allow AI to make all these game time decisions around which target, when, how to react to a defensive measure? And then ultimately, is the AI pulling the trigger for that final lethal decision? Ooh, that's complicated, but it's going to be increasingly automated to the point that some of the weapon systems that are getting built will analyze the situation on the field and make a decision quite literally in the milliseconds that it takes just for the human eye to observe something and send the neurological signal to our brain. The AI will have already acted. Next one, this is another one that I've been reading up on that I find really compelling. In order to accelerate the mass, but also the speed, is the idea of how do we bring our manufacturing to the front line? Instead of having these really convoluted supply chains with 100 different suppliers that then get aggregated in the US or one of our nearshore allies and then get shipped off around the globe to the South China Sea or the Middle East. This third prediction is that as the new technology is optimized for mass and speed, one of the game changers will be 3D printing on the front line. It's super compelling. There's all this new research around the 3D printing is so capable that it can live on the battleship. It can live on kind of the mobile base in Iraq or Syria and mass produce the supplies needed in the moment of need. Next one is, and this is pretty integral to just this larger thesis that I'm building up to, and that is that for the first 2 or 3 millennia, warfare was defined by tactics, organization, and yes, like weapons, but they were really small scale advances. For the last 2 millennia, it's been what you could call hardware advances, tangible materials. In this new millennia, it goes from tactics to hardware to software. The AI in the loop that is able to outmaneuver your enemy's drone systems or cruise missiles or defensive lasers, that AI will have a near undefeatable lead and margin for error. Software will thus need to be no longer a 3 to 5 year cycle like it currently is in the DoD, the US, but instead it needs to go at the same pace of our best software companies, which is 2, maybe 4-week sprints with updates and debugging, which requires an entire new way of thinking about software development across the US armed services. Next one, it's another one that I've been like reading up on that I find just so stimulating, is this idea that in this next era, AI will analyze decision making that typically would be reserved for the top brass generals and be able to war game out not what typically has been like the top 5 hypothesized simulations, but instead millions. So that when it does come time to simulate what are all the hypothetical possibilities of China attacking Taiwan, AI will generate all 1 million hypotheticals, test them out, build a solution set, and a statistical probability for each, at the same time that China is doing so on their end. Yes, there will be humans in the loop for the final decision making, but it's going to be so deeply algorithmic. It's going to be really different. Another prediction. I'm just going to keep on coming because I'm now trying to paint a picture for how different warfare is going to look in this next generation. The next one is even command posts are going to look different. What we're seeing now in Ukraine and Russia is top tier leadership needs to always be in very hardened defensive positions. That oftentimes will end up meaning deep, deep bunkers. The ones that the average drone and missile system can't even access. And that's also where the AI decision-making will take place. The idea of a US battalion being set up in Fallujah in Iraq in 2008, in the little tent city that I used to drive past, that's a thing of the past. That's so exposed, out in the open, and accessible for any state military like Russia or a terrorist militia to take advantage of. Which then means militaries will be increasingly decentralized in their geographic spread and highly mobile, and once again, capable of returning to really hardened defensive positions. It's going to look so different. Another one that is hard to fathom, but it's already proving out in Ukraine and Russia. When you and I conceptualize, what's the image of a soldier? Picture it in your head. It's the camouflage fatigues, the helmet, the Oakley sunglasses with the M15. The soldiers of this next generation are going to look a whole lot more like the software product managers that I hire day in and day out. Intelligent, tech savvy, capable of multifaceted technological problems from their computer. There's a case to be made that we'll still have armed infantry trained for some kind of hand-to-hand combat, but it's going to be such a small proportion. Like, how in the world would they fare against a swarm of AI-powered drones that can optimize their decision matrix before, once again, what the human soldiers capable of seeing and even processing the decisions made by the AI? The next one, this is getting a little long-winded, but I'm going to bring it to a close. Even the next round of exquisite military systems, the F-35 jet, the naval warship, is increasingly going to become merely a AI hub for dozens, if not hundreds, of other weapon systems that are controlled by that piece of military technology. It's the idea that the naval warships will primarily serve as just a launch pad for a variety of AI weapon systems. Already, the F-35, the U.S. fighter jet that I've bemoaned because it cost $2 trillion more than expected, and it took a generation and a half, and it's buggy. And right now, what's looking like will be branded the not F-35, but the F-47, this next generation warfighter. The whole idea is that that fighter jet will be surrounded by a host of smaller AI automated, both defensive and weapon systems flying in concert at all times with that one jet. One jet, one pilot, 20 or more weapon systems surrounding it, autonomously flying nearby. That's interesting. That's a crazy mental image. But that's what's currently like getting discussed at the Pentagon. It's crazy. One that could take like an entire series of episodes around the idea of the humanoid robot looking like it'll be battlefield ready in China by 2030. Quite literally like robotic dogs for sniffing out and like clearing buildings to make sure there aren't mines. That's going to be ubiquitous. But that new image that I'm now painting for what the US military needs to look like in this next generation and what the Chinese military is already optimizing for, it needs to enter our collective consciousness. This is where the world's going. And the US military, every day that it looks the same, we're falling behind. And I don't care that we spend sometimes 3.5 times more than the Chinese government or more than the next 10 governments combined. That's not how wars are going to be won and lost. It's not exquisite systems and who has the most manpower. My thesis statement that I've been building up to for, let's see, how many minutes now? 34 minutes. Is that the military of the future will look less like 1.3 million active duty soldiers and a $1 trillion budget and 750 military bases around the world. And it, in order to succeed, will need to act like a tech company. If anything, like a tech conglomerate with a variety of products, best-in-class teams, product managers, engineers, hardware developers, a whole vendor pipeline that's optimized, supply chain that's incredibly nimble. That kind of a military will need to operate at the same level of fidelity that you see a Meta or a Google or an OpenAI when they're pushing new software updates every couple of weeks that are best in class, with some of the top paid engineers, with some of the most sophisticated product managers, with like really brilliant teams around procurement, partnering with a variety of other tech companies. It's an entirely new image for the future. And it's one that I have yet to ever hear. And I listen to a lot of podcasts every week. It's a completely different imagination. And part of what has been consuming my thought life recently is that as more well-known American politicians come out against AI, yes, there's Bernie Sanders. Yes, there's AOC. But man, now there's Governor DeSantis coming out publicly against AI. I would really ask them to question, what will us overregulating AI, putting all of these constraints on innovation, mean for just our defense sector? Much less the host of other things that I've brought up over these last episodes. But what will it mean for us reimagining our armed forces to look far more like a military that could actually hold its own against Russia right now? Much less the Chinese war machine that's growing day by day. It's just a totally different image. So if you've made it this long, I know this is a little out of left field, a little niche, a little like, Quinn, AI defense systems, what are we talking about? But I really believe that in the history books, what we as Americans should be learning about what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia conflict needs to be incredibly instructive and needs to be part of the vernacular in DC. And I don't feel it to be that way. So if you found this interesting, send it to 2 friends. Send me your notes on what you think. I really do. If you find this curious, concerning, exciting, kind of doomsday-ish, I want to know. Because my heart in all of this is caring deeply for our country, and thinking a lot about like what's the kind of country that I want to leave to my little girl one day. Is it one that is safer for her, more accessible for her to achieve the American dream? And I think these are the conversations we need to be having. All right, another episode down. Thanks so much, and see you next week.